Chapter 1. The Shivering Stranger. The fire crackled low, its glow stretching shadows long against the pines. Elias Boone sat on a rough-hewn log, sharpening the blade of his hunting knife. When he heard it, the brittle snap of twigs underfoot, his hand stilled. The mountains rarely carried visitors, and those who came uninvited often came with trouble. He rose slow, every movement deliberate, rifle leaning easy against his shoulder. The air was cold enough to bite through leather, and a thin mist curled over the frozen ground. From the dark brush, a shape stumbled into view. It was a woman. She wore rags that once might have been a dress, clutched around her shoulders as if they could keep the mountain's breath at bay. Her hair was tangled, her boots barely holding together, and her steps wavered like she'd walked 100 miles without food. Elias narrowed his eyes. "You lost, ma'am." The woman swayed, then steadied herself with a will that surprised him. She looked at him through lashes heavy with frost, lips trembling as if speech was foreign to her. Finally, her voice rasped, no louder than the fire's hiss. "I don't talk much, mister." Her eyes dropped to the dirt, then lifted again, holding his with a desperate steadiness. "But I can cook and bear sons." The words hit the night like a shot. Elias blinked, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. Women out here didn't speak plain unless life had scraped them down to the bone. He studied her, hollow cheeks, skin pale from hunger, the faint tremor in her knees. Yet beneath it, there was something stubborn, something that hadn't broken even if the world tried. "You look half dead," he muttered. "Ain't no sense talking of sons when you can barely stand." Her shoulders hunched, shame flickering in her eyes, but she didn't turn away. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the fire popping and a coyote's distant cry rolling down the valley. Elias let out a slow breath, lowering his rifle. "Come closer. Fire's warmer than the trees." She hesitated, then stepped into the circle of light. Her hands hovered near the flames, thin fingers trembling as heat kissed them. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and the hard lines of survival softened just enough for him to see the woman beneath the dust. He turned back to his knife, though his eyes kept straying to her. "Ain't a skin you to talk much, but I'll ask your name." Her voice wavered but held. "Clara." "Clara," he repeated, tasting the sound like a man unaccustomed to saying another's name aloud. He gave a short nod toward his cabin just beyond the clearing. "You'll have a roof tonight. Tomorrow we'll see if you're as good at cooking as you say." She pulled the ragged cloth tighter, and for the first time a spark lit in her tired eyes. Hope mingled with fear. As the firelight flickered between them, Elias realized the quiet mountain night had just grown complicated. Chapter 2. Smoke from the Chimney. The first pale light of morning spilled over the mountains, painting the peaks in gold while frost still clung stubborn to the cabin roof. Elias stepped outside, the crunch of his boots sharp in the frozen earth, and exhaled into the cold air. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, something he hadn't seen in a long while unless he lit the fire himself. Inside, the scent of coffee mingled with the sharp tang of wood smoke. Clara moved slow but steady about the one-room cabin. Her sleeves rolled, her hands occupied with a skillet over the flames. Bacon sizzled, fat popping in the pan. Elias paused at the doorframe, rifle resting in his grip, watching her with the quiet suspicion of a man not used to strangers filling his space. Clara glanced up, catching him staring. Her eyes darted away just as quick. "I found beans," she murmured, her voice low, barely above the crackle of fire. "And dried meat. I thought you might want a meal ready." He set the rifle against the wall, scratching the beard along his jaw. Most women would have slept through half the morning after near freezing to death. She shrugged, turning back to the skillet. "Work keeps me warmer than blankets." Her words carried no pride, no complaint, just fact. Elias studied the way she moved, careful and quiet, as though afraid to take up too much room. There were scars along the backs of her hands, thin white lines that caught the firelight when she lifted the skillet. A story lived in those marks, but she wasn't offering it. Not yet. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the wood scarred with years of knife cuts and whiskey stains. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the scrape of utensils and the steady tick of the fire. Elias wasn't a man to chatter himself, but Clara's quiet seemed different. Less choice, more survival. When she finally set the plate before him, her eyes lingered on the food like she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to share in it. Elias pushed the plate a little to the side and reached for a second tin cup. "Sit," he said simply. Her breath hitched, but she obeyed, folded her hands in her lap until he slid half the bacon and beans onto another plate. She hesitated before taking the fork, her fingers trembling. "You don't have to keep looking like I'll take it back," Elias muttered around a bite. "If you're staying here, you eat." Clara's lips parted as though she meant to thank him, but the words tangled somewhere in her throat. Instead, she bent her head and ate, slow at first, then with the hunger of someone who hadn't tasted more than scraps in days. The fire popped. Wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls, and outside, the wilderness stretched wide and merciless. But for the first time in years, Elias realized he wasn't alone at the morning table. And for Clara, her silence was no longer only survival. It was a beginning of belonging. Chapter 3, Trouble at the Saloon. The town of Ash Hollow lay crouched in the valley like a stray dog, dusty, mean, and always hungry. Elias Boone guided his horse down the main street. Clara seated stiffly behind him, clutching the worn leather of his coat. Her eyes darted from the weathered storefronts to the swinging doors of the saloon, where laughter, piano notes, and the sharp ring of glasses spilling whiskey spilled into morning air. "Keep close," Elias said, his voice low but edged with warning. "Men here don't got manners." She nodded, though her hands tightened on his coat, as if his words only fed the storm of nerves already inside her. The saloon doors creaked wide when they stepped inside. Smoke hung thick, curling above the crowd. Spurs jingled across the warped floorboards, and every eye in the place turned to size up the mountain man and the woman at his side. Clara shifted under the weight of their stares, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Elias led her to the bar, boots heavy against the floor. "Whiskey," he told the barkeep, tossing down a silver coin. Clara sat on a stool beside him, small and out of place amid the painted women, card players, and men with too much whiskey in their blood. That's when the whispers started. "Boone's finally gone and got himself a woman," one man muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "Pretty thing, though a mite scrawny," another chuckled. The laughter rippled, and Clara's cheeks burned crimson. She dropped her gaze to her hands, fingers wringing the hem of her shawl. Elias's jaw hardened. He ignored them, until a ranch hand with crooked teeth and liquor on his breast swaggered up, planting himself between them. "Evenin', miss," the man slurred, tipping his hat though his eyes held no respect. "Can't reckon what a sweet gal like you's doin' with a grizzled hermit. Bet you prefer a man who knows his way around town." Clara flinched, leaning instinctively toward Elias. Elias rose from his stool, slow as thunder building over the mountains. He squared his shoulders, his shadow falling across the ranch hand. "She ain't interested," he said flatly. The man sneered, puffing his chest. "I wasn't a skin you, Boone." He reached for Clara's arm. The sound that followed was sharp, a fist cracking against jawbone. The ranch hand staggered backward, crashing into a card table that splintered under his weight. Cards flew, whiskey spilled, and the saloon erupted in shouts. Elias stood firm, fists clenched, ready for the next fool to step forward. Clara pressed a hand to her lips, eyes wide, trembling, but in them burned something new. The raw shock of knowing this man would bleed before he let another touch her. The ranch hand crawled to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth, but thought better of testing Elias again. He spat into the sawdust and slunk out into the street. The piano started up once more, the saloon's noise rushing back in like a wave. But for Clara, the world had narrowed to the broad-shouldered man beside her, his hand flexing where bruises already swelled. "You all right?" Elias asked gruffly, voice softened the fists he'd just thrown. She swallowed, nodding. Her hand, small and tentative, brushed against his arm. "I am because of you." Elias said nothing, only lowered himself back onto the stool, but in his chest a strange warmth stirred, hotter than whiskey, stronger than solitude. Chapter 4, Firelight Confessions. The storm rolled in fast that evening, wind howling through the pines and rattling the shutters of Elias Boone's cabin. Snow swirled against the window panes, piling deep, shutting the world outside. Inside, only the fire kept the dark at bay, throwing long, restless shadows over the rough plank walls. Clara sat near the hearth, her knees drawn close beneath Elias's old wool blanket. Her face glowed in the firelight, though her eyes were far away, locked on memories Elias could not see. She had been quiet all night, quieter even than her usual self, and the silence pressed on him heavier than the storm outside. Elias sat at the table, running a cloth over the barrel of his rifle. He'd been watching her from the corner of his eye, waiting. Finally, he set the weapon down and spoke. "You've been carrying something heavy since the day I found you." His voice was low, steady. "Storm's loud enough. Ain't no harm if you set it down." Clara's hands twisted in the blanket. For a moment, he thought she might retreat into that silence forever. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze, and her voice came out brittle, like a branch that had seen too many winters. "I was sold, Elias. Passed from one man's hands to another, like I was worth no more than a horse or a sack of grain. Cooking, cleaning, being told what I was good for, until one night I ran." Her breath caught, and her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I got nothing left, only my work, and the chance I might give a man's sons if he wanted them. That's all I know how to offer." The fire popped, sparks leaping up the chimney. Elias's throat tightened, though he masked it with a slow drag of breath. He had known loss. Bandits had taken his brother and father in a single raid years ago, but Clara's words carried a wound of another kind, one that no bullet could answer. He crossed the room and lowered himself onto the floor opposite her, the fire between them. His rough hands rested on his knees, calloused from years of work. He let her see the truth in his eyes before he spoke. "Clara, you ain't property. You ain't a bargain struck in a saloon." His voice softened, gentler than he knew it could be. "You're a woman who walked through hell and still kept her feet under her. That's worth more than sons or supper." Her lips trembled, a tear slipping down her cheek. She tried to hide it, but Elias reached across the space, his hand closing over hers. Her fingers were small, cold, but alive, and they didn't pull away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the storm shrieking outside and the fire breathing between them. In that silence, something stronger than words passed, something binding. Clara's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I don't know why you want someone as broken as me." Elias's thumb brushed the back of her hand, rough but sure. "Maybe 'cause I've been broken, too. And two pieces might just make something whole." The firelight danced in her eyes, and for the first time, Clara smiled. Not wide, not easy, but enough to thaw the ice that had caged her heart. Outside, the wind raged. Inside, hope flickered to life. Chapter 5. The Gunfight at Dawn. The valley was still dark when Elias Boone woke, though the air carried a prickle that told him trouble was near. He pulled on his boots, the leather stiff with cold, and stepped outside. Frost glittered pale on the grass, and the mountains loomed silent, holding their breath. Then he saw them, shadows moving against the pale horizon, for riders cutting across the ridge. Their horses snorted steam, hooves dull against the frozen earth. Elias knew before they drew close. He'd seen that brand of cruelty in men before, the kind that left women hollow-eyed and running for their lives. He slipped back inside, voice a low growl. "Clara, get your hands on the shotgun." Her eyes flew wide, but she didn't waste breath asking why. She moved quick, pulling the weapon from behind the door, checking the load with a surety that surprised him. Fear tightened her face, but her jaw was set, harder than he'd ever seen it. The first gunshot split the dawn, echoing like thunder through the valley. Bullets splintered the cabin's wood, showering sparks from the hearth. Clara ducked low, clutching the shotgun, her breath sharp in her throat. Elias crouched by the window, rifle braced on the sill. "Stay low," he ordered. "If one of them makes it close, don't hesitate. You pull that trigger." The riders circled, yelling curses, trying to rattle him. Another shot punched through the shutters. Elias answered with his rifle, the crack tearing through morning. One outlaw toppled from his horse, hitting the frost with a thud that stilled the shouting for a heartbeat. Clara flinched at the sound, but her hands tightened on the shotgun. Her heart pounded, but she thought of the night spent running, of being owned and sold and caged. No more. If they came through that door, she'd make sure the mountains swallowed them whole. Another rider spurred close, firing at the cabin's frame. Elias turned, but before he could take aim, Clara rose from behind the table. The shotgun roared, smoke filling the cabin, and the outlaw's horse reared, throwing him hard into the dirt. Elias gave her a sharp nod, pride flashing his eyes, then swung his rifle to meet the next. Shots cracked, powder burned the air, and the fight raged fierce, loud enough to wake the mountains. At last, silence fell, broken only by the groans of the dying and the restless shuffle of riderless horses. Elias stepped into the pale dawn light, smoke curling from his rifle barrel. One outlaw crawled in the frost, reaching for his gun, but Elias didn't give him the chance. The final shot echoed, then faded into the stillness. When Elias turned back, Clara was in the doorway, the shotgun still trembling in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with something fierce, something alive. "You did good," Elias said, voice rough with pride and weariness. She lowered the shotgun, her breath unsteady. Crossing the yard, she touched his arm, her hand gentle over the blood that seeped from his shoulder where a bullet had grazed. Her voice cracked, but held steady enough to matter. "I'm not running any more, Elias," she whispered. "Not from them. Not from this." Elias looked at her, at the woman who had walked out of the wild half-dead, and now stood fierce and unbroken. In that moment, he knew the mountain had given him more than a battle. It had given him a partner worth bleeding for. Chapter 6. A Home in a Valley. Spring crept into the mountains slow, as though the land itself wasn't sure it was ready to soften. Snow melted into streams that sang through the valley, green shoots breaking through soil hardened by winter. Elias Boone's cabin stood sturdy on the ridge, smoke curling from its chimney, no longer a sign of one man's lonely survival, but of a shared home. Elias leaned his weight against the handle of his axe, wiping the sweat from his brow as he studied the cabin's new addition, a second room, framed with fresh pine, its walls rising straight and true. His hands ached from the work, but it was the kind of ache a man welcomed, the ache of building, not of fighting. Behind him, the soft hum of a tune carried on the breeze. Clara stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour, her hair braided neat. A pot simmered on the stove inside, the smell of rabbit stew drifting through the air. She pressed a hand absent-mindedly to her middle, where the faintest swell hinted at the life growing within. Elias's chest tightened at the sight. He had thought himself a man carved from stone, but the woman had proven he still had a heart that beat strong. "Cabin's starting to look like a ranch house," Clara said softly, her voice steadier now than when he'd first heard it by the fire months ago. He grunted, half smiling. "Figure you deserve more'n a one-room shack. Baby'll need space to grow. Maybe two if the Lord sees fit." Her cheeks flushed, and she lowered her gaze, though a smile touched her lips. She stepped out, crossing the yard barefoot, her skirts brushing the new grass. When she reached him, she laid her small, flour-dusted hand over his rough one. "I thought I'd never belong anywhere," she whispered, her eyes shining with a truth too deep to hide. "But here, with you, I feel like I've come home." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Elias looked down at her, at the woman who had once stood shivering on his trail, and now stood strong beside him. He slid his arm around her, pulling her close, his voice rough but certain. "You gave me more than sons, Clara," he said, the words rolling out like they'd been waiting years to be spoken. "You gave me a reason to come home." She pressed her forehead against his chest, eyes closing as his warmth surrounded her. The mountains stretched endless beyond them, golden with the sinking sun, and the call of the lone coyote echoed through the valley. The world was still wild, still dangerous, but for Elias and Clara, the ridge had become more than a place to endure. It had become their refuge, their promise, their love carved into the heart of the West. And as the firelight glowed behind their cabin windows that night, the valley whispered back their vow. They were no longer alone. The sun sank low over the plains, setting the horizon ablaze in gold and crimson. Elias Boone reined his horse at the ridge above Ash Hollow. Clara seated behind him, her arms circled tight around his waist. Below, the saloon's piano drifted faint on the evening air, mingling with the wind that carried the scent of sagebrush. The town looked small from here, a place full of ghosts they had both outlived. Elias turned his head slightly, catching Clara's profile in the fading light. Her face, once drawn by hunger and fear, now glowed with quiet strength. The bandits who'd hunted her lay buried by the valley, the scars of her past fading into something new. His cabin waited behind them, smoke curling from the chimney, and for the first time in years, Elias felt not just a weight of survival, but the pull of belonging. He reached for her hand, rough palm closing around her slender fingers. "Clara," he said, voice husky, "I thought I was meant to die up here alone, but you gave me back the part of me I thought was gone." She pressed her cheek to his back. Her words carried soft into the wind. "And you gave me a home, Elias, a name, a life that's mine." The last light of day spilled over them as they rode toward the valley, their silhouettes etched against the burning sky. Two souls scarred by the West, now bound together, stronger than the mountains themselves.